All right, let's get started. So yes, welcome back everybody to the security stream for the GSE conference. And my name is Jamie Pease. I'm the chair of the security working group and of course this security stream. So you remember from yesterday, Bob Hansel from RACF Consulting was on our agenda at 2 o'clock yesterday, and he's back with us at 2 o'clock today to do a session around RACF monitoring and reporting. And as I said yesterday, for those of you that don't know Bob, I think many of you do now. You know, you've probably stumbled across his material. Certainly, if anything like me, you're looking for some solve some problem, and often you'll come across RSH Consulting's collateral, which has been incredibly useful. And of course, Bob frequents RACFL and is famous for his surveys as well, which he showed us yesterday. So Bob, without further ado, welcome back again to GSE, and the stage is yours, sir.
Thank you very much, and looking forward to doing this presentation. Well, for those of you who didn't attend my session yesterday, I am here today speaking to you from Cambridge, Massachusetts. So the other Cambridge. And as I mentioned yesterday to folks, this is my bio and the like. This year is significant in terms of anniversaries for me. It's 45 years working in IT, most of that time in mainframes, 40 years in cybersecurity, and 35 years working with RACF. And next year is equally important to me because it'll be 30 years for anniversary for RSH Consulting. So you are hopefully getting the benefit in this presentation of 35 years of working with RACF and all the ways to do it right and all the ways I've done it wrong. So you know, we'll try and give you the tidbits you need so that isn't an issue for you. And this presentation, monitoring and reporting, is some of it is rather basic and elementary, but I've tried to sprinkle it with a lot of things that would be of interest to somebody sort of in an immediate or even at an advanced level, some interesting tidbits of things you may not know and how some of this monitoring works and some of the things you can stumble on in the process. So over the next hour, we're going to look at just some basics about monitoring with RACF. And then we'll dive into looking at monitoring for various resource and profile types. We'll talk about user monitoring. We'll look at resource monitoring. We'll look at high-level authority monitoring. Much of that is involving setter ops related settings. We'll look at monitoring and SMF record considerations. And then lastly, we'll touch on some reporting tools that you have native to you in RACF. So monitoring basics. So RACF terminology for monitoring is auditing, and all the settings related to monitoring in RACF are all have the term audit in them. I kind of wish they hadn't used that term because it gets confused with what an auditor does, but hey, that's what they chose. RACF auditing generates SMF records, system management facilities records. So RACF uses that common log collection tool that's available to all products within the system. You know, unlike some of the other products that have their own audit logs, of course, RACF uses the ZOS one. Now, auditing options can be specified in the RAC route macro. That caller of RACF can influence what logging is done through a log parameter on that call. And we'll talk about those options coming up. There's auditing you can specify in the user profile, auditing again in the resource profile, and again in setter ops, as we've just mentioned. And we'll take each of these in turn. So something to be aware of with regard to, you know, whether you get out of RACF monitoring what you hope, you have to look at all the steps in the SMF generation and reporting process. The reporting tools require comprehensive SMF data collection and retention to be effective, right? So you cannot report that which isn't there. So you look at your log collection and reporting process. So the very first thing is the resource manager has to be configured to call RACF for authorization checks. And further, with that RACF parameter doesn't suppress logging. So one of the, as you may well know, if any of you have dealt with security for any reasonable length of time, one of the real challenges with securing your system with RACF is ensuring that the resource managers are calling RACF. And oftentimes that's product configuration options, and the tech support people and not you may have control over that. So you want to make sure that everything's talking to RACF to begin with, so that at least you have the opportunity to do logging, and then that it doesn't suppress logging. Now, there's some good reasons to do that. And when we look at the log options that are available to you, we can talk about those. But for the most part, you want records to be made available to you. Now, even if the resource manager allows you to generate log records, you've got to make sure the RACF options are set so that you're collecting the information that you need to oversee your environment. And a lot of this presentation is centered around that. Now, even if RACF generates an SMF record, SMF itself has to be configured to collect and save the records. And there are some type and no type settings in your SMF parameters that govern that. And that's sort of beyond the scope of this presentation, but I mentioned it here for completeness. Now, even if SMF saves the record, you got to make sure that it gets dumped, which means, copied off into a save file and then archived and retained, right? So that you can do future reporting. And then lastly, the software tools need to generate comprehensive reports from this SMF tool. So, you may have the data there, but if you're not using your reporting tools effectively, you're going to miss important events in your environment. So there's a lot of bits that all have to get it right in order to ensure that you've got the records that you need for RACF. All right, so what are those SMF records? Right, so these are the series that are generated specifically for RACF. You've got the 80 records, and this is going to be 99.9% of your logged events. So this is, logons for most of your products, access authorization, Unix events, all, access events, all these are in 80 records. So that's going to be your primary focus you're going to look at when you're doing your reporting. There are 81 records. These are RACF initialization. You get these at system initialization and startup. And they're basically a snapshot of setter-ops list is essentially what they look like. And then there are 83 records. So 83 records are various special types of audit records. And really it's the subtype within 83 that tells you something about what generated or where this record came from. So one is data set sec label changes. So if you're doing multi-level security, which most of us aren't, and changes are made to sec label, you'd see an audit record related to that. 2 are identity, our enterprise identity mapping related events. 3 LDAP. 4 R audit X. So R audit X is a callable service where you can generate your own log records if you also have access in the facility class.irr.rauditx. 5 is WebSteer, and 6 is Tivoli Key Lifecycle Manager for managing your certificates and the like, and your encryption keys, I should say. So you won't see those very often, if at all, in your environment. It depends on what your product mix is and what you've implemented. Now, these are the RACF records, but there are some other records that are of great interest to us as well. When it comes to logons and logoffs for TSO, batch, and started task, there are other records that are generated in the system that your reporting tools actually will use and look at for these events. Now, there's the 20 record and the 30 record. The 20 record could be used for job initiation. The only product that uses that in terms of a native reporting tool is the RACF RW command, which, we'll talk about later, has been deprecated for many years now and not enhanced. And instead, what most of your reporting products are going to use, including things like SMF unload, is the 30 record. So the 30 record is your common address space work record. And in particular, you're interested in the subtypes 1 for initiation and 5 for termination being log off. Now, it is in more than half the cases where I go in to work with a shop and do remediation work, and we're going to be using the SMF data, I say, show me your SMF archives that are specific, extracts specific to RACF for reporting. And as I say, in more than half of those cases, they've got the 80 records, but not the 30 records. So they're missing a lot of activity that's going on in their system. So we end up, usually we end up remediating that before we do any other remediation. And an interesting question, and Jamie talked about my surveys, an interesting question I posed now more than a few years ago, right, was how long does your organization retain these RACF related records? Now, on more than one occasion, I've been asked to go back at least 18 months to see if there were any activity we could find for a given user for some reason or another. And my general preference is to at least keep things for 3 years. And I was surprised by the results of this survey where, fully, if you add them two together, 1 year or less than 1 year, you've got a third or more of your organizations that are keeping their SMF records for a very short period of time. And, I think that's probably not a good practice and may very well not meet regulatory requirements. And I believe over in Europe, your requirements require at least 7 years. I think it's GDPR, if I remember correctly. So it's sort of surprising how often shops keep it for a very short period of time. And that's another thing we often end up remediating in our work, is getting them to change that retention and making it longer. So now let's begin to look at some of the audit options that influence whether or not you even will cut an SMF record. So this is the rack route macro. It's got a log parameter, and this can either expand or suppress auditing. So, and there are different audit options depending on what type of request it is. So request auth. For log, your options are none, no stat, no fail, and as is. As is the default. None, no logging or console operator messages. So why would I do a request auth with none? Well, usually this is menu building type of calls. When you go into SDSF initially, right? SDSF runs through a whole series of authorization checks, all related to displays. Can they see this? Can they see this? Can they see this? And they build the menu based on all the return code zeros they get back, right? So that's not, the user's not trying to do anything nefarious. They're not trying to use something they're not allowed to use. We're just using it to build their menu. So you wouldn't want to log those as violations. TSO auth. TSO and TSO auth works the same way. When you first enter TSO, it checks to see what your authorities are, all with log none. No stat takes that a little further and says not only none, but we don't do profile statistics, which, unless you've got statistics turned on in RACF, which I would encourage you not to do, you wouldn't be collecting that anyways, doesn't make a big difference. Now, no fail. No fail is kind of interesting. You won't log violations, but you will potentially log successes if the audit records are set accordingly. And one of the ways that I've used this can be useful to see, well, this is a menu building in many cases issue. We won't see the failures, but we will see what they are getting. And one of the things I like to do is if I'm working with Broadcom CA Endeavor, in its tables, you can actually set what log option will be used that Endeavor will use on its rack route calls. And for the menu building set, I like to specify them. And by the way, they all default to none. I like to set it to no fail. That way, if I put UAudit on a user, I can see the positive authorizations that come back for that user, and that may help me with troubleshooting and the like. And then there's as is, which is log in accordance to whatever the profile or setter options specify, and that is typically the default. We'll leave it to RACF to decide whether or not to log things. And by the way, one of the things I'll mention here as well, this governs SMF. If you have a product like Z-Secure Access Monitor, that's going to collect access activity, even if the caller specifies none. So you can augment your SMF with data from a product like that, which we find very handy in our remediation work. All right, so that's request auth. Request fast auth, very much the same. None, no fail, as is. Now, interestingly enough, the default there is none. By default, fast auth will not log anything. Why? Because when fast auth was first created back in the 80s, it never logged. So ultimately, they added the capability for fast auth to log, and I think that was done somewhere around the early mid-90s. But since the prior behavior was it didn't log, they made the default behavior that it still doesn't log, because IBM is loath to change anything in your environment. But newer written products now have the opportunity to take advantage of the logging that's done by fast auth. All right, and then there is request verify and verify X. So this is your logon, right? So none, as is, and all are the options there. None is no logging of logons. As is, the default is only log violations. And all is log all access events. So for instance, if you log into CICS, you'll see an SMF record. If you log into IMS, and with a successful access, I should say, correct password, you log into IMS, you won't. Although I understand maybe in these most recent releases of IMS, they have changed that. It may also depend on product profile configuration options. So I've worked with Broadcom CA-TPX as a session manager. Well, it uses as is, so it will only log violations. But if you call up tech support for the product, they will show you a hidden administrative panel where there's an option on that panel where you can cause all logons to be logged. It'll change that as is to an all. And so, look at your various products and see if they can also log logons. So that's often desirable to do, again, to trace user activity in the system. All right, so it all begins with rack route. Do we allow logging? And then, assuming that it does, now we begin to look at RACF options for logging. So beginning first with users, right? You have UAudit, user audit attribute on a user profile. You put UAudit on a user ID and all access is logged. Everything they touch is logged, unless the access is granted by the global access table, or this is a privileged started task, or again, the caller specifies rack route log none. Now, this is great to use selectively to monitor untrusted or external users, and you can use it to log trusted started tasks, which can be useful for remediation purposes or just oversight and monitoring. I like this feature. We use this a lot for remediation when it comes in very useful. When I'm going to do work for a client, I say, put UAudit on my ID. That way you can see everything I've touched. And there's no question about what I've done. And obviously that offers me the defense that I can say, well, I didn't touch that. And, if something went south, so you have a log record to show that, I didn't do that. So useful in remediation and for access activity, as I've mentioned already. You got to be a little bit careful with this because for some IDs, it can generate just an enormous number of SMF records, especially if they are accessing Unix. because when you go into the Unix directory structure, every access to every directory. So if you're after a file that's 6 directories down in the structure, and your user has UAudit, you will get a directory search for all the top level directories down to and finally including that file. So one opening of a file could generate 6 SMF records. And if you put this on something like a WebSphere ID, wow, be prepared for big logs. Another one we found this to be a problem at one shop was we put it on a secure FTP server process, and it turned out it was accessing the CSF serve class and CSF keys class at enormously high rate. So that's another one to be careful with in terms of logging. Furthermore, just the last point to understand here is you've got to have auditor authority to add or remove UAudit. In fact, you've got to have auditor authority to even see it on a user ID. And then lastly, with user monitoring, there's a couple of logon events that are always logged regardless. Authentication using a pass ticket, that's always logged. And authentication of a IBM multi-factor authentication user where they used a password or password phrase. Maybe there was an MFA problem and ended up having to log in with a password or phrase. Those events are always logged. All right, so that's user monitoring. Now let's look at resource monitoring. And I have 2 options here to look at. One is auditing, and the other is, you'll see a little bit below there, is global auditing. And both of those exist whether they're on a data set profile or a general resource profile. So let's look at that. So we have audit, as we show here, and global audit. With both of these, you specify an option or options and a corresponding level. So what are the options? These are the options. Success, that's an authorized access. Violation is a failure. Failures is violations. All is both, and none is no logging whatsoever. Now, along with the options, excluding none, right, you specify a level, and RACF logs at that level and above. So read is the default. So if I'm logging at level read, I will also get update, control, and alter events. Now, understanding the options and the levels, let's go back over here to audit, right? And audit is set by the profile owner or special, so a user with special authority. The default when you create a profile is failures read. And for probably 99% of your profiles, failures read is where you want to be, right? That's fine. That's more than enough. You want to log violations. And by the way, one thing I encourage shops to do is let it default to failures read, or always keep failures read on all your profiles. And I say that for this reason. Sometimes shops, they try and get a little too clever. In other words, let's suppose that the UAC is read, and so their thought is, well, I don't need to log violations at read. The UAC is read, so I'll log failures at update and above. But if you've got a user who's restricted, you know, or something other like that, where they would get a violation on read, you're not going to see that because you're auditing at update. So just always ensure you include failures read, even if this is a profile like a started profile, then you just never have a problem. You'll never miss things as a result. So you've got audit, then you've got global audit. Global audit is set by someone with auditor authority, and the default begins at none. You can't add global audit in your add DSD or define command. You add it after the fact with alt DSD or alter. Now, the 2 of these are used in combination. So if either of them says log it, then you do. Realize, though, that privileged and trusted started task access is not logged, is not affected by these settings. Why? because you check privileged and trusted right at the beginning of the authorization process in RACF. And if they grant the access, you're done, you're out of there, you know, return code 0. It never gets to a profile, so it never sees the audit options. Now, if you want to log successes for sensitive resources, right, and you want to log at a level of successes that's different than the violations, then you would specify audit success update failures read. One of the things I've seen a common mistake is you're auditing failures read now, you want to audit successes, so you do, you know, an Alt DSD audit successes update. You hit enter, fine, now you're auditing successes update, but you're no longer auditing failures read, because when you do that Alt DSD or alter command, it replaces the audit settings in their entirety. It doesn't add or change an option, it replaces. So you've got to specify both if you want to make sure you're auditing both. And then if you want to audit at both successes and violations at the same level, you can say audit all. And I show here. Now I'll mention one other thing that's interesting with regard to auditing as well. And you'd see this on all your data set and general resource profiles. There's a level on them, defaults to 0, 0. Well, that level is kind of interesting. A lot of people don't take enough advantage of it. It's on the profile. If you set it at some number other than 0, right? There's a number on the profile. You can use that in your search command to say, show me all the profiles that have this level. One of the things I love to do in a shop I'm going in is I'll set for your APF authorized profiles, you know, the profiles protecting APF authorized libraries. I'll set those to something like level 1. Now I can go in and do a search and say, search, you know, class data set, no mask, level 1. And now I see a list of all the profiles that are protecting APF authorized libraries. That's handy. But the other nice thing about level is that number also goes in every SMF record that's generated as a result of this profile. So now, if I want to see, show me all the updates and above for any APF authorized library or profile that's guarding an APF library, I can just go into SMF and use as a selection criteria level 1. And now I see everything related to APF. So that's a neat way to categorize records and use it for selection criteria. I do the same when I'm cleaning up obsolete things. I'll throw a level 86 on it, right? And if I see no records after some reasonable period of time, and I have no reason to believe they aren't being logged, then hey, yes, now I can get rid of those resources. So level's kind of cool, very handy. So further with resource monitoring, and now we're going to be looking at setter ops options. There's some options on that very first line, S-audit, command violation, oper audit. Then you have audit classes, which is just a little further down in setter ops. And then a good bit further down, you have log options. So let's look at each of these in turn as they relate to monitoring. So high-level authority monitoring, setter ops, S-audit, special audit is what that is. So that's going to log or audit all RACF commands executed by a special user. That's good. Okay, we want those. We want to see what our administrators are doing. It also audits all resource access used by using special authority. Now, access using special authority? Yeah. If you've got protect all turned on in fail mode for data sets, a user with special authority can access unprotected data sets. You get an ICH 48I message indicating that they're doing this access. And if you have S-audit turned on, you will get a log record of those events. So that's one of the rare instances where special authority gives you access. Then there's oper audit. So this will audit all resource access using other operations authority. So if a user with operations goes to access a data set and they are not permitted access, And then they fall, it falls to operations authority, and operations allows the access. With Oper audit turned on, I will now see an SMF record related to that. But it's only when they actually use operations authority, right? And I make the point a little further down that this could generate a massive amount of SMF records. You got to be careful with this. But one of the ways to address that is you permit access. So one shop I was working with, they ran all their production processes under a single batch ID that had operations authority. And yes, there's a whole lot of other things I could have done or would have done if this client had let me. But what it was doing is it was generating 1 million SMF records a day for using operations. And what I did is I did some quick analysis here, and I said, look, this ID is hitting all of these production profiles, and it's getting alter access. Let's just permit alter access to these profiles, since that's what it's getting anyway, was operations. And we dropped the SMF records from 1 million a day to about 10,000 a day. So it can make a huge difference. If you don't need those records, you can do the permit, you don't use operations, you don't get a log record. Now, one of the other things it shows there that you log with Oper audit is you audit all add DSDs using operations authority. Yeah, operations authority will let you create data set profiles for group data sets. This is another reason why I don't like operations authority and try and avoid it at all costs, right? So you can actually administer security for group data sets. Another good reason to avoid it. But if you have Oper audit turned on, you'll see that. And lastly is SetterOps command violation. This is auditing all violations using RACF commands by anyone. Now, search and list type command violations are not logged. And in many cases, you don't see many records related to command violations. It's rarely invoked because many cases you go to use a command and you're not allowed to do something. RACF treats it as a syntax error. Oh, you're not allowed to list this or act on this. Pick something you can. It comes back and prompts you to fix the command. So you will see some violations, but don't expect to see a lot by having this turned on for that reason. All right, that's the first line in SetterOps. Now we look at SetterOps audit, and audit is set on a class by class basis. Audit audits all changes to RACF profiles in the associated resource class. This audit, SetterOps audit, is the most misunderstood option in RACF, and as far as I can tell. People think it audits access. It does in a few cases, as we'll see, but for the most part, it's auditing profile changes. Anytime anybody changes a profile, and you want that, you want to see if anybody's changing profiles in your environment. Now, if you have S audit and Oper audit turned on, well, you're going to capture 99% or more of the RACF changes in your environment, but maybe not all of them. There are other authorities that allow you to change RACF profiles. If I'm a TSO user, I can add and delete, change profiles for my TSO data sets. If I have class authorization, I can create profiles in a given class. If I own, my user ID owns a profile, I can change it. If I have create, connect, or join authority in a group, I can create data set profiles, I can connect users to the group, I can potentially even create users. None of that will be logged if you only have S audit and Oper audit turned on. So you want to turn on audit, right, for your classes to see if there are any other changes. Now, there's a few instances where doing so does cause some records to be created under certain other actions or conditions. So, and I list them here. So data sets, if you audit data set, you will also get creation and deletion of every data set. Well, you might think that's a lot, but it's not generally that much. And given the overall volume of other SMF records, it's really generally a drop in the bucket. FSOBJ, creation and deletion of Unix file system objects. IPCOBJ, creation and deletion of inter-process communication Unix objects like semaphores. process, dubbing and undubbing. So it's kind of like, connecting and disconnecting from Unix, right? Using Unix system services, right? And normally this doesn't generate that many records. Now I was at one shop where they were undergoing a project where this is a health insurance firm. They were taking the sheets that users get every time you go to the doctor, whatever, you get a sheet that says, here's the service that was performed and all that. And they were converting those to PDFs and migrating them off to another platform. So if you can imagine, for tens of thousands of customers that they had, health insurance customers, with hundreds, if not thousands, of these sheets, these service sheets, they were taking each one by one. They would convert it to a PDF, copy it to a Unix file, and then FTP it off one by one. 20 to 30 million of these per day. And that was the number of SMF records being generated. And it was all because of FSOBJ and process being turned on. So for the life of this project, they were getting ready to migrate off their mainframe anyway. So the life of that project, we turned those off for audit. But that's one of the rare instances where I've ever felt the need to do that. A couple of other things. With audit, if you turn it on for user, you get all password changes. Anytime they change their password, even if they're doing it during logon or logon screen, you don't know what the password is. You simply know that they changed it. And also, if you're taking advantage of the option to automatically assign OMBS segments with BPX unique user, then if a user gets an OMBS segment, that event is logged. And then auditing group, that class, again, with BPX unique user, a group gets an auto-assigned OMBS segment, that will be logged. So with rare exceptions, that's not a lot of too much additional information. And you want to know if somebody's making changes to profiles in your environment. So we recommend you turn on auditing for all your classes. And it's simple. Setups audit, open paren, asterisk, close paren, enter, done. Now we come to log options. Now this is related to access. So it specifies a level of access logging enforced for each class. Every class you have will fall under one of these audit levels. Always, never, successes, failures, or default, right? Always log all access in this class, never log no access in this class. Successes, log all successful accesses. Failures, log all violations. And default is do whatever the profile says. Log it if setter ops in the profile says otherwise, don't. And that is, as I say, the default. Always successes and failures tends to augment resource profile auditing, so it gives you more than the profile might ask for. Never suppresses resource profile auditing, except it doesn't do so for UAudit logging. Unfortunately, I would love to be able to suppress dir search events for Unix, like we talked about. But as soon as you slap UAudit on an ID, boom, you get those records. In fact, I've been in discussions with IBM, and I think I put in an RFE to find a way to turn that off for dir searches because it just drowns you. Now, always is kind of interesting. Always logs all accesses for a given resource class, even if there's no profile. The class just has to be active. Really useful when we're going into remediate Opera commands, or in particular to implement SDSF protection where they haven't previously implemented Opera commands. We activate the Opera commands class, we put it under always, and boom, now we see everything that's going on, even the stuff that isn't protected. So we then synthesize and massage that data, figure out what profiles we need to set up and set up the permissions. So it's really, really useful from that standpoint. And it even logs trusted started tasks just within that class. Now, do be aware log options is ignored in a couple of cases, right? It's ignored if access is granted by the global access table, or you're using fastauth. So fastauth doesn't look at log options. If you want to log something that's that's being checked with FastAuth, you've got to turn on auditing on the profile. So you would do that, for instance, in Unix, Priv, or VTAM Apple. Or again, if rack route says log none, you're not going to see it then either. Now, there are a couple of classes where we strongly urge you to set log options at levels other than default. They're related to Unix. Under always, you want to put fssec. That will log all changes to file system security. So somebody changing, doing something to permission bits or setting up ACLs and the like. This will cause that to be logged. It's kind of like setting up either audit or S audit, but only within Unix. And then there's a couple of other classes that you should specify under failures: process, procact, and IPC OBJ. There's no profiles related to these classes. So there's nowhere in a profile I can turn on auditing. If there are violations for access in these classes, processes, UID and GID changes, procact functions affecting other processes, and IPC OBJ is inter-process communication stuff. Again, you're not going to see those violations unless you set them up under failures, under log options. And when I go in to do remediation, probably at 90 to 95% of shops do not have this turned on. So I urge you to do that today. One last little tidbit as well, get PSEnt, get process status information. It has the potential to generate a lot of violation records that may not be true violations. In other words, you don't want a process to have this authority. So the only way that IBM will show you that's going on is you've got to turn on log options always for procact. Then you can see those violations. But if you just turn it on procact for failures, you won't. I encourage you periodically to turn this on. Set up always at procact for short periods and see if you have processes out there asking for process information, because you might want to allow that access and you're not knowing today that there's a violation. Okay, so that's most of the setup options. There's a couple of others, APPC, application program communication related, and multi-level security auditing. The only one really you might be interested in is Apple audit. This is APPC related. This allows user verification auditing, allows it, I should say, emphasize that at the beginning and end of a user's APPC transaction processing. Now, you turn this on in SetterOps. Then what you do is you turn on auditing in the Apple class for a specific profile that's related to APPC and MVS logical units, right? You either put audit all read or global audit read, and then you'll see those events. It too can generate a lot of SMF records if that application doesn't support persistent verification, which means it's every time you do a transaction, you're logging on again. And so that can, like I say, generate a lot of records. You got to be careful with it. Just keep an eye on it when you first turn on. And that's Apple audit. Now, the other two I just showed there for completeness, and I won't talk about them further. What authority do I need to administer auditing options? Well, it turns out in most cases it's auditor authority, right? For UAudit, user UAudit. So I show, here's a profile owner, special auditor, RO audit. UAudit, to list it, you've got to be an auditor or RO audit. To set it, you've got to be an auditor. A special user or profile owner doesn't even see it when they list the profile. Resource audit option, your owner or special, you can list and set it. If you're auditor or RO audit, you can list it. But global audit, again, profile owner and special can't even see it. To see it and or set it, you've got to be auditor or RO audit just to list it. And then the SetterOps audit options, the ones we just covered, log options, audit, to even see it, you've got to be auditor or RO audit. And to set those at SetterOps level, you've got to be a system auditor, right? So you won't even see, if you're just a special user, you won't even see it when you do your SetterOps list. Some monitoring considerations, things to think about. Warnings. Warnings, you get an ICH 48i message for a warning, but it might not be logged. So warnings will only be logged if either audit or global audit are set to log either success or failure events at the level associated with the user's insufficient access, like read. So if you're logging, if you've got a profile in warning and you're logging at failures update and above, and a user comes in with a read violation, no SMF record. This is another reason why I say, hey, make sure all your profiles have at least failures read on them and you'll be good. Alternatively, if the profile audit doesn't say do it, SetterOps UAudit will do it. That also would, you'd see a record if the user had a warning. And log options could also cause logging for a warning if that class is set for success or always. A warning is a success. It's not a failure. So, you know, you would have to have log options set to log successes to see warnings just based on the log option setting. But that again is assuming that you're using request auth and not fast auth, because fast auth doesn't do log options. Something else that's interesting, since we've mentioned fast auth, right? With RACRoute fast auth, if the audit options are not set to log a violation, you won't even get an ICH 48i message on the console. Now, you know, since whenever I go in and set up RACF, you know, I always set out audit failures read. So I never knew about this until a couple of years ago, about 5 or 6 years ago. I was working with one shop. They'd done a conversion to ACF2, and for whatever reason, the conversion, almost all of their general resource profiles had been set up with audit none. So we said, well, we've got to fix this. So we changed all the auditing settings to failures read, and the system log just lit up with ICH 48i messages, and the tech support people came running in. What did you do? You've done something bad and stopped all this access. And all we did was make the violations visible. They didn't even know they had these violations going on because it wasn't being logged, or they weren't getting ICH 48i. As soon as we turned on the auditing options, they saw it for the first time. And they were quite surprised, to say the least. Search, list and search commands, that usage is never logged. More on that in a second. All SetterOps command execution is automatically logged, even SetterOps list. Privileged access, never logged. Global access table access, never logged, except if you have SetterOps audit turned on for the dataset class, you will see dataset creations logged, even if the global access table granted you alter. RACF exits, they can expand or suppress auditing. They can change the attributes of your call that you're making to RACF. So if you have exits, you need to know what they do. Access granted during fail-soft processing. So if you go in and you have to shut off RACF, and now we go into fail-soft processing, everything there is logged. And you can optionally, within your own application, you can cause log records to be generated with a RACRoute request equals audit. So that's an option that's available to you in your own coding if you wish. Now, those list and search commands, they are a hacker's dream. Because if I want to know what I have access to in RACF, do I have access to the storage admin keyword to copy data sets? I just do an RList facility, stgadmin, ADR stgadmin copy. It'll either come back and say one or two things. You're not allowed to list that profile. That immediately tells me I have no access. Or it will show me the profile, in which case and it'll show me at my access level. So then I do know what access I have. So in our pen testing sort of work, first thing we do is we run through our lists and list DSDs of everything in their environment that's sensitive, and we figure out what can we do. Now, wouldn't you want to know if somebody's doing that? So what we recommend you do for monitoring is define program profiles to monitor the use of all your RACF list and search commands and their aliases to see if somebody's using them to probe your defenses. Now, the way we do that is we do an R-defined program class, the commander alias, UAC read. We don't want to stop people from using commands necessarily. We just want to see if they're using them. So admem, it's in link lab. Then what we do is we alter program command global audit all read. Now, why global audit? Well, if I'm allowed to list the profile, I can see what the auditing is set to, but I can't see what the global audit is set to. So if, again, I'm probing your system, I'll do an R list to see if I have access to list commands. And if I think I have audit failures read, and that's all, I know I'm safe to use that for my probe. But if you've put global audit read on there, then you're monitoring my use of the commands, and I won't know that. So, it's a tripwire sort of thing. So commands to protect, I show the list commands, their aliases, and I would also include IRR UT100 utility in that monitoring as well. So I encourage you to do that. See who's using these commands in your environment. Now we come to reporting tools, and I'm just showing the RACF, basically stuff here that's available to you, now and today. Not any of the add-on products. So you've got RACF RW, report writer. That was stabilized in 1992 when they came out with Unix, Open Edition MVS, right? They decided that they were not going to try and do reporting on those events. So they said, okay, so report writer frozen, anything added from 92 on, now almost 30 years, right? Next year is going to be 30 years. RACF RW won't report. But you'd be amazed, in probably 20% of the shops that I go into to do remediation, they're still running RACF RW, and they're missing stuff as a result. Instead, what IBM gave you was the SMF unload, right? These are the SMF dump utility user exits, and it takes that raw SMF data and puts it into a format that you can use for subsequently processing. And for unload processing, especially if it's just the straight text, not XML, you can use DF sort and ICE tool for that. IBM provides this one, SampLib IRR ICE, with examples there. You can use Rex. We use Rex with it all the time. Just do all kinds of reporting from it using Rex, and in combination, many cases, with ICE tool. And you can dump the stuff in DB2 and use SQL reporting for that. So a bit more on the unload. It creates either text or XML formatted data from the unformatted raw, binary SMF data. As I said, you invoke it as user exits in the SMF dump utility, either, SMF DP or DL. DL is for log streams. The one drawback to SMF unload is there's no pre-unload record selection criteria. You dump the entire file. Now, we at RSH, we address that on our own. We build ourselves a tool that goes in and picks out just the raw SMF records we want, and then we run it through unload to get cut down reports. But SMF unload itself doesn't give you this. They do provide you with SQL to load the data into DB2. The text data can be browsed, right? Sometimes we'll just browse the output and we can get our answers to our questions. XML data can be viewed in the HTML browser, but again, if you're dumping an entire file and the whole thing is in XML, then the XML file is huge and really unwieldy to try and use. And it does require some programming skills to generate reports. And I show you an example down here of the text output that you might see. And this is just the first bit of very long records. And here I show you an example, SMF unload utility, where I'm doing it, and you see down here, so I'm using IFA SMF DP, and all the stuff in red is related to the unload. So here are my user exits. I have an ADU print output, gives me status of the processing of the SMF unload. And then I code one of these three DD statements. XML form, if I want to get XML with every line is one tag. So one record could generate, 50, 60, 70 lines. Or XML out, where I get all the XML strung out for a given event, strung out in one long record. or I do out DD and I get the text, right? And that's where I get the text, like the sample I just showed you. Now, SMF unload only produces one of these outputs. I show the DDs in order of precedence. So if you coded XML form and out DD, you'd only get XML form. So then in this list here. One of the things, by the way, when you're doing this, you want to use a copy of the SMF unload programs from the very latest release that you have in your environment of RACF, because I've seen cases where SMF data is processed by back level releases of SMF unload, and it's missing stuff because the older versions of SMF unload don't know about some of the newer fields and data. So you want to use the most current software. For effective reporting, you want to ensure you've got correct, comprehensive SMF data sets to be included in your processing. Make sure you get all the record types, 30s as well as 80s. If you've got multiple system images, you want to make sure that you're getting data from all of the images and merging that together for your reporting. Make sure your reporting tools are coded to select desired records for ensuring all violation events are requested, all warnings of successes are selected. Years ago with RACF RW, they showed examples in the manual of how you do a request for event access. And everybody coded their RACF RW that way. Well, yeah, event access is one type of violation, but there's also define and rename and delete and a few others. And everybody was missing those because they weren't coding the reporting tool correctly. You want to report on important types of activity that should be generated. You know, again, sensitive resource, critical resource access, warnings, activities on UAudit users, logons by undefined users. You want to know if there's any of those running around in your environment, operations storage admin use, and security administration actions. You want to make sure the reports are organized for efficient review, maybe break your report down by topic area. And it's wise to disseminate this information out to the user and resource owners who may be better at spotting something that's amiss if they know their user population or their resources better than you. And then reporting resources. So, you know, reference material, you got the IBM manuals, you got the auditor's guide, which talk about the unload utility and options and macros and interfaces for those unload record formats. There's my website. We have presentations out there on the utilities, on DF-Sort ICE tool, on RACF and REX. We have newsletters with lots of articles related to logging in SMF. We have our surveys on most of the options we talked about. We've done surveys on them. Those are out there. And, you know, one related in specifically to SMF record retention. And then there's Sample ICE, Nigel Pentland. His stuff is still out there, and he offers lots of reporting tools, and as does Steve Neelan. Although his stuff is now in sort of an archive format. I don't know if it will always or continue to exist and for how long. So there you have it. So monitoring and reporting. So I hope, you know, if nothing else, maybe you picked up a few interesting tidbits along the way. I do see one comment or question out there. DF-Sort or equivalent can be used to pre-select records, for example. Yes. In fact, the tool that we created to do that pre-selection uses DF-Sort and ICE tool. So very much that's the case. So Jamie, let me turn it over to you or to anybody in the audience if you have any questions or comments or anything you'd like to discuss at this time.
Oh, thank you, Bob. I picked up quite a few tips from that, and it's actually amazing, isn't it? You know, you see this stuff every day, and you just sometimes you've forgotten about it, or it's like, actually, I don't really quite understand the meaning of that. And I think this session has been really, really good, from not only from a refresher standpoint for some, but also picking up new things, like you said. But yeah, without so does anybody have any questions? You by the way, you can unmute your line if you want to throw a question to Bob. No. One thing I want to do, there's a couple of things I sort of picked up on, Bob. Many things I actually picked up on, but of course we don't have the time to go through all of them. But it was the the logging of list commands. So a little story here, a very brief story. I almost got tripped up on this. I'm so glad you brought that tip up about the program tip that you gave for logging. That I was on a project where we were onboarding a number of privileged users to CyberArk. And one of the questions that kind of I asked is, well, do we actually need to onboard all of these users? Are they actually using their attribute, like group special? And then it kind of dawned on us, well, actually, they might not be doing any updates, sort of, like connects or things like that around users, but they might be listing things. And it was kind of at that moment, the light bulb, and I'm thinking, how are we going to log? How are we going to capture this? How are we going to kind of report on this? But as it happens, the site that I was working with, they had Z-Secure Command Verifier. So there's a couple of policies that you can implement that were implemented already that were actually logging the relevant SMF records, so we could actually see list activity. But if you don't have a product like that, or the equivalent, I think Vanguard have, I'm sure they've got the similar kind of policies. That you really do need to sort of think about the lists are just sometimes as important as the updates, aren't they, from the scenario that you describe, but also if you're trying to do sort of cleanup work.
Along that same lines, just to be aware of, if anybody's using Access Monitor, as I say, we've used a lot and I really like it, but it does not log program use, because Z-Secure puts in post-processing exits to do its logging, and the program class does not use the post-processing exits. So your only option might be like your command verifier you talked about, or auditing the program profiles. You won't get it out of Access Monitor.
But I think Hans said yesterday, because Hans Schoner was with us yesterday, I think he said they fixed that, or they put in a new enhancement in 2.5. Yeah, Andrew Cameron Heffer, thanks Andrew. Yeah, he said Z-Secure 2.5 will do it. That's good. I wasn't dreaming it then. I'm sure Hans said that. So yeah.
Well, that's true. That's good.
Yeah. That is good. Yeah. And the other thing that I picked up on was around level fields. For recording things like for classifying things like APF and and for the logging aspect of that as well. But I wondered now, with this sort of introduction of custom fields for general resources and dataset profiles, whether that's something that people might switch to in the future. To sort of replace levels, for classifying things.
I would use it for that purpose, and I think it'd be good with that. But the advantage to level is you can query, you could use it as part of your search command query, and it shows up in SMF records.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Dave Constable had a comment there about not being able to audit program classes. And yeah, we've found that you can. If you put audit all read on a program profile, you can definitely audit it.
There you go. So any more closing thoughts from anybody? Any more questions? Like I say, you can unmute your line. And I like your comment, Andrew. Yes, you need it. I think we all do. And Dave says thanks. And one final point on the retention period. That's a really interesting question, that I've heard a lot of discussion around over the more recent times, especially with some of the tougher regulatory requirements. And I think, that's certainly in the UK. I think, like, if you're a financial services institution, I think it's like 6 or 7 years. You sort of is the minimum. And maybe some of you out there, some of our viewers, maybe correct me on that, but I'm pretty sure that's the minimum standard if you're in that sector. Okay, so Bob, thank you once again. Like I said, I got a lot from that session, and so thank you for taking the time to prepare and present to us. So folks, this is session 1BH for the purpose of feedback. So if you could do that, so Bob's brought that up on his screen now. Don't forget, quick recap, I'm sure you're all pros at this now in completing the feedback form, but question 2, the best answer to give there is 5, not 9, otherwise you're basically saying the session's too long. So 5 is the optimum, and then the number that you think is appropriate for the remaining questions. So if you could do that, click on Bob's session on the agenda, on the online agenda, and you'll see the feedback link at the bottom there. Don't forget our charity as well. If you remember that we're doing this conference for free, and we're all volunteers. And so if you want to show your appreciation to any of the sessions, then your donation would be gratefully received. And we're getting quite close to our target now, which is fantastic to see. So, and this session is recorded, by the way, so if you think you've missed something, you can always go and listen to the replay when those links appear on the agenda in a few days' time. So now we have a break until 3:30, and we will be back at 3:30 in the security stream with Isha Powers from IBM. She'll be telling us what's new in ZOS crypto, so hopefully you can join us for that. And Bob, like I said, thanks once again. I'm sure we'll have you back on the at GSE again at some point in the future. Really enjoyed your session, so thanks once again.
Thank you. I enjoyed it, and I appreciate everybody's kind attention.
Okay, thank you.
Bye now.